In our video for this week, we gathered a list of top 10 myths about transgender people that people often believe. 1. Transgender people live crazy lives.
This is probably the most common misconception about trans people. Many people incorrectly associate being transgender with automatically living a crazy lifestyle based on TV and in the movies. This may involve drag performance, hypermasculine or hyperfeminine behavior, drugs, or prostitution. Some trans people, and some non-trans people too, engage in the above behaviors. But all transgender people do the everyday things that are a part of life. They go to work, buy groceries, see movies, kiss their kids goodnight.
2. Transgender people hate their bodies.
This is a very common myth. It does make sense that a person who identifies as a woman might be uncomfortable in her male body, and vice versa. And some transgender people are uncomfortable and want to alter their bodies. Others choose to live with their bodies as they are. Neither choice means that this person hates themselves. On the contrary, a transgender person can love themselves through the whole process of transitioning. And we can love them too. Each person's relationship with their body is unique, and we should support every transgender person in doing what works for them.
3. Transgender people are gay.
Gender identity and sexual orientation are two completely separate characteristics. One is what gender we see ourselves as being. The other is what gender and sex we are physically and romantically attracted to. Knowing one doesn't tell you about the other.
4. Transitioning is as simple as one surgery.
Transitioning is a long, complicated process that involves far more than medical procedures. Trans people also have to go through personal, legal, and social changes, and some may go through some of these changes but forego medical procedures entirely. Trans people individually decide how they'll express their gender identity in different public and private settings. They may decide to be fully open with some people but cautious with others. Some trans people will also undertake legal changes, such as changing a name or switching a gender marker on a driver's license. And those who are willing and can afford it will go through medical procedures, including hormone therapies, gender-affirming surgeries, or only some of the medical options.
5. Children aren't told enough to know their gender identity.
Some children genuinely identify with a gender different from the one assigned to them at birth at a very early age. And some others won't conform to gender norms, but won't necessarily grow up to identify as transgender. A study from the Trans Youth Project found that trans children as young as 5 years old respond to psychological gender association tests, which evaluate how people view themselves within gender roles, as quickly and consistently as those who don't identify as trans.
6. Transgender inclusive health care is expensive.
The cost of health plans doesn't increase much, if at all, if they include transgender inclusive health benefits. The Human Rights Campaign, an LGBT advocacy group, estimates that trans-specific treatments can cost between $25,000 and $75,000, which is minimal compared with other healthcare needs. And very few patients require these treatments, since trans people make up less than 1% of the population, making the cost relatively small for major health providers. These treatments can also save health insurers money in other areas, since trans people who receive care are less likely to struggle with gender dysphoria.
7. Laws support trans people.
Although social acceptance of transgender people is increasing, laws are not keeping pace. Currently, no federal law protects trans people from discrimination, so state by state and even city by city, trans people continue to fight for their rights. Some locations have laws that protect against discrimination in housing and employment, but in many places trans people have no recourse if they are fired or evicted simply for being trans. A number of legal organizations provide information on trans rights across the United States, and make it clear that there is still much work to be done.
8. Transgender people perform drag shows.
Conservative thinkers would love to point to a singing, shimmying, scantily dressed, heavily made up drag queen slinking across a stage and say, that is a transgender. But, they're wrong. In fact, did you know that the majority of gender performance is done by non-trans people? Because, it's just a performance. It's not about real people. Drag queens and drag kings do drag for theatrical, comedic, and at times, political purposes. They do it for their art and they do it with you, the viewer, in mind. When a trans woman wears women's clothing or a trans man wears men's clothing, they are not doing drag. They are just wearing their clothes.
9. Transgender people are confused.
Just because a person is different, doesn't mean they don't know who they are. Trans people have a sex. They are females, males, and intersex. Trans people have a gender. They are men, women, queer, and other genders. They know their sex and they know their gender. This can be confusing to us who inhabit more traditional gender roles, but to the transgender person, it is not confusing. It is just who they are. That said, coming to the realization that you are trans, and coming out publicly as trans, in a society that doesn't accept or understand you can be very confusing and hurtful.
10 transgender people are mentally disturbed.
It's true that many transgender people suffer from mental illness. But it's not because of their gender identity alone. It's because in a patriarchal society, being gender variant causes a lot of distress. So much distress, in fact, that it can be described by the diagnosis of a mental disorder. This diagnosis is helpful because it tells us that this person is hurting and something needs to be done to help. Transgender people have the same brains we do. They are just faced with a lot more mental and emotional stress.
That was it for this week's video. Do you know any other misconceptions about transgender people we didn't mention? Until next time, don't forget to like and subscribe for weekly amazing videos.